The door closed before he could say anything. Not slammed, exactly, but firm, final, the kind of close that didn't invite questions or people back in. Malcolm Reed stood on the polished stone steps of the house, pizza bag in hand, receipt still unsigned. A few drops of rain clung to the brim of his cap. His jacket was damp from the walk up the long, curved driveway. Inside, he could still hear laughter, the soft chime of cutlery. Someone turned up the volume on a television in another room. He waited a few seconds longer, just in case someone realized they hadn't tipped. No one did. He exhaled quietly, then turned. The neighborhood was quiet, gated, manicured lawns, columns, imported tiles, a place where people owned wine cellars they never visited and home gyms they never used. He'd been here before, not this exact house, but this feeling. The look that said, "Here's your food, now leave." The tone that carried politeness but not respect. The dismissive nod, or worse, the lack of eye contact. To them, he was the delivery guy. Nothing more. And that was fine. That's what the job was. That's what the uniform said. Black cap, branded jacket, hot bag in one hand, printed receipt in the other. But what the uniform didn't say was that he used to wear a different one. One with a name tag that read, Dr. Malcolm Reed. One with whiteboards full of equations and lecture halls filled with students. One that came with questions like, "Professor, how do you explain quantum decoherence in layman's terms?" He shifted the pizza bag to his other hand and walked back toward his car. Nobody knew who he used to be. And nobody cared. But that was about to change. He reached his car, a dented Toyota Corolla with a cracked taillight and a chessbook tucked under the passenger seat, and slid into the driver's side without a word. The scent of pepperoni and garlic lingered in the air. He set the insulated bag down, pulled out the next address on his app, and tapped, "Delivered." A small note blinked onto the screen. Customer did not tip. Malcolm didn't sigh, didn't shake his head. He was used to it. He turned the ignition, and the engine coughed twice before settling into a low hum. Backing down the driveway, he glanced once more at the grand two-story home behind him. The lights were warm, the curtains drawn. Inside, someone was telling a story. Someone was laughing. Someone else, maybe the father, had just told his son, "That's why you need to study hard, kid, or you'll end up like him." Malcolm didn't need to hear it clearly. He'd heard it before. Different words, same meaning. Like him. A phrase that carried centuries. That erased stories. He didn't hate them, not even the boy, not even the father. But he wished just once that someone would look beyond the jacket, beyond the label, beyond the role they'd already decided he belonged in. Not to admire him, not to praise him, just to see him, because Malcolm wasn't always a delivery man. Once, he had stood before lecture halls and explained the laws of thermodynamics to rooms full of students who scribbled down every word. Once, he'd written peer-reviewed papers on gravitational anomalies and debated entropy with physicists from Oxford. Once, he was called professor. But tonight, he was just the man who brought the food. Malcolm Reed hadn't always lived like this. There was a time not too long ago when he stood behind podiums, not steering wheels, when people called him doctor, not sir, with impatience in their voices. He earned his Ph.D. in theoretical physics from MIT at age 29, published 2 groundbreaking papers by 32. By 35, he was lecturing at Princeton, mentoring doctoral candidates, flying to conferences, and fielding invitations to co-author textbooks. His specialty? High-energy particle dynamics and quantum symmetry. Fields so dense, most people stopped listening after the second word. But his students listened. Because Malcolm didn't just teach equations. He told stories about the stars, about the invisible forces that held the universe together. And somehow, he made black holes feel personal. He loved it. Not the title, not the recognition, the teaching. Helping people understand something they thought was beyond them, and watching the light come on behind their eyes. But life had its own kind of physics. Momentum, collapse, entropy. Malcolm's collapse came in the form of illness. His wife, Janice, was diagnosed with cancer 2 weeks after their 15th anniversary. Stage 4. Sudden. Aggressive. He tried to juggle it all: lectures, research, caregiving, hospital bills. But the university moved on. Funding dried up. Class schedules shifted. Sabbatical requests were denied. And after she passed, he didn't go back. Not to the classroom. Not to the faculty meetings. Not even to the house. Grief rearranged his orbit. And eventually, he let it. He sold the house in New Jersey, donated most of the books, boxed up her scarves, but never opened the box again. For a while, he lived in his car. Then a shelter. Then a low-income apartment on the edge of the city, where no one asked what he used to be and he didn't offer. He found part-time work where he could. Tutoring at first. But parents didn't want a man with no updated credentials, no LinkedIn activity, no shiny website. So he took whatever paid. Driving, lifting, delivering. Pizza became a kind of refuge. The transactions were simple, the expectations low, the tips unreliable, but occasionally generous. What stunned him most wasn't the fall, but how invisible he had become afterward. At the university, people used to hang on his every word. Now, they barely heard his voice. Once, a teenager at a fast food drive-thru asked, "Didn't you used to be someone?" Malcolm smiled and said, "I still am." But some days, he wasn't sure. The chalkboard had been replaced with a GPS. The lectures with directions. The applause with doorbells. And yet, he didn't feel bitter. He still read. Every night. Physics journals, scientific papers, open-source university lectures. He couldn't afford the latest textbooks. But the universe hadn't changed, and he still loved learning its language. He never expected to teach again. Never expected to be seen again. But somewhere inside, beneath the silence and the grease-stained jacket, the teacher remained. Waiting. The order came in around 5:42 p.m. Large pepperoni, garlic knots, side of wings. Paid in cash. Delivery address. Westover Hills, the kind of neighborhood where house numbers were carved in stone and dogs had better health care than people. Malcolm tapped accept and set out. The sun was low, casting long shadows across manicured lawns. He pulled up to the gate, gave his name, and was buzzed in after a pause that lasted just long enough to remind him he didn't belong. The house was massive. White pillars, circular driveway, 3 cars in the front, all gleaming. He rang the bell. It was the boy who opened the door first. Maybe 12. Sharp haircut, phone in hand. Behind him, a man appeared mid-40s, blazer over jeans, Bluetooth earpiece still blinking. "Delivery?" the man asked, barely looking up. "Yes, sir. That'll be $28.15. The man handed him 2 20s, without making eye contact. "Keep the change." Malcolm nodded. "Thank you. Have a good evening." The man had already turned. Max closed the door, but the boy lingered. He looked Malcolm up and down, then smirked. "Is this all you do?" he asked. Malcolm blinked. "Excuse me? I mean, like, is this your real job or just until you figure something out?" Before Malcolm could respond, the man called out from the kitchen, "Max, don't pester people who are working." Then, as an afterthought, "And listen, son, this is why you study hard, so you don't end up like that." The door closed. Again, Malcolm stood there for a second. Not in anger, not in shock, just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when you're reminded, once again, that people will build entire opinions of you in the span of 5 seconds, without ever asking who you are. He turned and walked back down the steps, the heat from the pizza box still warming his hand. His car was quiet. No radio, no music, just the sound of his own breath as he sat behind the wheel, letting the moment settle. He'd been delivering food for over a year now, And yet, this felt different. There was something in the boy's tone curious, not cruel. And something in the father's words casual, like he was talking about a type of furniture, not a person. He knew that tone. He'd heard it in faculty lounges too, just dressed in different vocabulary. Malcolm put the car in gear. As he pulled away from the house, he glanced once in the rearview mirror. The boy was still standing behind the window, watching him go. That look stuck with him. Not because it hurt, but because it wasn't finished. 3 days later, another order came in. Same address. Same name. Blakeworth. Malcolm hesitated, briefly, then accepted the order. When he arrived, it was the boy Max who opened the door again. This time, there was no smirk, just wide eyes and something almost like anticipation. "Hey," Max said, shifting from one foot to the other. "Hi," Malcolm replied, holding up the pizza bag. Max took it but didn't move. Then, abruptly, "Do you know anything about like physics?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Depends what kind of physics." Max glanced over his shoulder, then stepped aside just enough to reveal the kitchen table. On it sat a sleek black laptop and what looked like a half-built science fair project, wires, sensors, and a small screen flickering with code. "I'm trying to build a gravity simulator," Max explained fast. "For school. But it's acting weird. My code keeps crashing whenever I input mass variables over 10 circumflex 3. I tried scaling the force vectors manually, but..." He trailed off. Malcolm blinked, then smiled just slightly. "Let me guess. You're using a basic Euler integration?" Max nodded slowly. "That's your problem." He stepped closer without thinking, setting the pizza bag down on a side table. "You're hitting numerical instability. You need a more accurate method like Runge-Kutta, maybe fourth order." Max stared at him. "You know that?" Malcolm didn't answer. Instead, he leaned over, pointed at a line of code, and said softly, "Here. This is where your simulation is collapsing. The force values spike too fast, and your time step is too wide. Try adjusting that first." From the hallway, a voice interrupted them. "Everything all right out there?" It was the father. Max looked nervous. "Yeah, Dad. Just talking to the delivery guy." Another pause. Then footsteps. Mr. Blakeworth stepped into view, holding a tumbler of something amber. His eyes landed on Malcolm. Then the laptop. Then his son. "What's going on?" Max spoke quickly. "He was just helping with my physics project. The simulation kept crashing, but he figured it out." Blakeworth frowned, skeptical. "You code?" Malcolm nodded. "A bit." The man raised an eyebrow. "Funny. You don't look like a coder." Malcolm gave a tight smile. "That's not the first thing people say when I walk through the door." Blakeworth folded his arms. "So, what is it? You used to be an engineer? Technician?" There was a pause. Malcolm glanced at Max, then back at the father. "I used to teach," he said simply. "Physics, theoretical and applied. Mostly dynamics, orbital mechanics, high-energy systems." Blakeworth laughed once, incredulously. "Where?" "Princeton." Silence. Even Max stopped tapping on the keyboard. Blakeworth blinked. "As in, the university?" Malcolm nodded. "I held a full-time position for 11 years. The father looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Not as a delivery man, not as someone in a branded jacket, but as something more than what he assumed. Malcolm didn't gloat, didn't expand, didn't drop credentials. He just stood there, calm, collected, as if the equations were still on the board behind him. "Why are you doing this?" Blakeworth asked, voice quieter now. Malcolm shrugged. "Life shifted. I do what I need to. Doesn't mean I stop knowing things." Max broke the silence. "Dad, he's right. It worked. The simulation's running smooth now." Blakeworth looked at the screen. The miniature planetary system Max had built was now orbiting steadily, no crashes, no glitches. For the first time that day, the father didn't have a clever response. Only a question growing in his mind. Who else had he overlooked, simply because of the shirt they wore? Malcolm didn't plan to walk back inside. But something in the boy's voice, that mixture of frustration and curiosity, pulled at a part of him that hadn't been touched in years. The part that once stood in front of lecture halls. The part that remembered what it felt like to unlock a problem and hand someone the key. So when Max asked for help, Malcolm paused at the doorway. Then turned. "I can take a look if you want," he said. Max lit up. "Seriously? If your dad's all right with it." Blakeworth hesitated, but pride gave way to confusion, and confusion gave way to curiosity. "Go ahead," he muttered. "Let's see what you got." Malcolm walked in slowly, the smell of garlic knots still hanging in the air. He leaned over the laptop, scanning lines of code, dozens of them, stacked like a chaotic staircase. He found the issue in under 3 minutes. A floating point overflow in the force calculations. A mismatched time step. A simple integration error that spiraled out of control because the simulation lacked boundary dampening. He didn't fix it with a Google search. He fixed it from memory. From the kind of knowing that only comes after a decade of debugging particle trajectories and teaching 19-year-olds how to trust math more than instinct. He explained as he worked. Max followed every word. Blakeworth said nothing. Then Malcolm hit run. The simulation came to life. Planets spun. Gravity held. Everything flowed. Max stared at the screen, then back at Malcolm. "How did you fix that so fast?" Malcolm pointed to the block of code he'd rewritten. "Your simulation was using a basic Euler solver," he said. "Good for simple problems, terrible for systems with rapidly changing forces like gravity." Max furrowed his brow. "So, what should I have used?" Malcolm smiled. "Try Runge-Kutta, fourth order. It's more stable for nonlinear systems, especially when you're modeling orbital paths." Max blinked. "Runge what?" "Runge-Kutta. It's a numerical method. Think of it like, instead of taking one big leap and hoping you land on your target, you take several smaller, smarter steps to predict where you're going. More work, better results." The boy's eyes lit up like he'd just unlocked a secret level. "That makes sense," Max whispered. "That really makes sense." From the doorway, Blakeworth spoke for the first time in minutes. "You teach this stuff somewhere?" Malcolm didn't even look up. "I used to." "You're a tutor?" Malcolm shook his head gently. I was a professor." Max turned toward his dad. Blakeworth asked quietly, "Where?" Malcolm finally looked up, not proud, not ashamed. Ph.D. Then Princeton. 11 years. Silence fell over the room again. Only the sound of the soft, stable hum of simulated planets circling one another. The room felt different now. Same lights, same furniture, same pizza box still open on the counter. But something had changed. Blakeworth stood straighter, like trying to re-anchor himself in a conversation he no longer controlled. His wife had entered quietly during the explanation. She stood near the hallway now, arms folded not in defense, but in dawning realization. Max looked from his dad to Malcolm, then back again. It was the boy who broke the silence first. "You worked at Princeton?" Malcolm nodded. "For more than a decade." Blakeworth cleared his throat. What happened?" Malcolm didn't offer excuses. He simply said life. Then he added, "Sometimes the classroom changes, but the knowledge doesn't." Blakeworth rubbed the back of his neck. "I just assumed." He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. They all knew what he had assumed. The cheap jacket, the delivery car, the job. Malcolm didn't gloat. He didn't twist the knife. He just gathered his receipt from the table and looked at Max. "You've got a good project. Keep pushing it. And don't let error messages stop you sometimes. They're the best teachers." Max nodded, quiet but focused. Blakeworth stepped forward, awkward now, humbled. "Wait. At least let me." Malcolm stopped him with a soft shake of the head. "No need. You already paid." Then he turned, walked to the door, and left. This time, no one closed it behind him. Blakeworth's voice came again, softer this time, almost unsure. Wait, seriously, where did you say you studied? Malcolm paused by the doorway. He turned just enough for his words to carry, but not enough to invite awe. His voice was steady, almost casual, but it landed like thunder. Mitt, he said, ten sievert li twit. Then, after a quiet breath, he added, Karu Zhangvi in Princeton. No one spoke. Even Max's fingers hovered above the keyboard, as if afraid to type in front of someone who wrote the equations most kids only copied. Blakeworth's wife stared at Malcolm like seeing a different man entirely, not a delivery driver in a branded jacket, but a person who had once walked the halls of institutions with marble floors and Nobel laureates. Malcolm gave a nod, not seeking approval, just closing a chapter. He didn't wait for admiration. He didn't need it. He opened the door. A gust of evening air rolled in crisp quiet. Before stepping out, he looked at Max one last time. You've got a good mind, trust it, but stay curious, always. Max nodded slowly, lips parting, but no words forming. And then Malcolm Reed, Michigan T, Ph.D., former Princeton professor, stepped back into the night. A delivery man, with nothing to prove, and everything already said. The room was silent long after the door closed. No one moved. No one reached for another slice. Even the television in the background felt too loud now. Max sat in front of the glowing laptop screen, eyes still locked on the orbiting simulation Malcolm had just repaired. He wasn't just impressed. He wasn't just surprised. He looked stunned, like someone who had just shaken hands with a time traveler, or met a wizard wearing sneakers and a pizza bag. His father slowly lowered himself into a chair, as if trying to find balance not just on the cushion, but inside his own certainty. Mitt, he said under his breath. Princeton. His wife was the one who said what they were both thinking. We judged him. Max looked up. We didn't even ask his name. There was no rebuke in her voice. No self-righteousness. Just realization. Max finally spoke, voice quiet, reverent. He knew what I was trying to do before I could even explain it, and he made it make sense. Blakeworth didn't answer. He was still staring at the door, still trying to reconcile the man who stood there minutes ago with the one he'd assumed was no more than a guy who couldn't get a real job. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't sure if his success meant he actually understood anything at all. That night, Blakeworth didn't sleep much. He sat in his office, the lights dimmed, the untouched glass of whiskey sweating on his desk. His laptop sat open, the tabs still active: news, finance, schedules. But his eyes weren't on the screen. They were on the memory. Malcolm's voice. His clarity. The way he said, Runj Kuta, like most people say, hello. The calm with which he named two of the most elite institutions in the country, as if they were mere footnotes, not badges. Blakeworth leaned back in his chair, suddenly aware of how shallow his world had become. He'd built his career judging competence by posture, polish, and presence. A firm handshake, a crisp suit, a perfect pitch. But none of that had fixed his son's project. Malcolm had in 5 minutes, using words that his own college professors had never bothered to explain. It wasn't just humbling, it was embarrassing. He thought of the way he'd spoken to Malcolm on the first delivery. The quick dismissal. The comment to Max, that's why you study hard, so you don't end up like that. The irony stung. Max had looked more engaged with Malcolm in 5 minutes than he'd looked with any of his private tutors in 5 years. And that scared Blakeworth more than anything. Because for the first time, he realized he hadn't just misjudged a man. He'd modeled misjudgment for his son. The next morning, Blakeworth called in late to work something he never did. Instead, he sat down with Max at the kitchen table, 2 mugs of hot cocoa between them. I owe you an apology, he said. Max looked up, surprised. For what? For how I treated him, and for what I said in front of you. Max stayed quiet, waiting. Blakeworth continued, I made a mistake. A big one. I looked at someone and saw a job, not a person, not a teacher, not a story, just a uniform. He shook his head slowly. And that's not the kind of man I want to be, or the kind of man I want you to become. Max didn't respond with words. He just nodded once and sipped his cocoa. That afternoon, Blakeworth opened his laptop and wrote a post. He didn't write it to go viral. He wrote it because silence, in this case, would have been cowardice. Last week, I dismissed a man because of his job. I judged him before I heard him. And then he taught my son more about physics and humility in 10 minutes than any classroom ever has. His name is Malcolm. He used to teach at Princeton. But even if he hadn't, I should have treated him with the same respect I give to anyone who walks through my door. Asterisk. He hit post. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel important. He felt human. Malcolm never saw the post. He didn't have social media. No Twitter. No LinkedIn. No inbox full of likes. His phone was 10 years old. His circle, even smaller. But he did notice something start to shift. Customers who once barely looked at him began saying, "Thank you," with meaning. A few even asked how his day was going. One woman invited him in to fix a printer, just in case he knew about wires too. He smiled politely, said little, but inside, he felt the subtle pull of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Being seen. Not admired. Not celebrated. Just acknowledged. For Malcolm, that was enough. He hadn't set out to teach anyone anything that night. He was just doing what he always did, helping when he could, explaining what he loved, and carrying the weight of a life that had taken turns no resume could capture. But somewhere in that moment, somewhere between the error in Max's code and the look in Blakeworth's eyes, a door had opened. Not to a job, not to a second chance at academia, but to something deeper. A reminder that value doesn't expire with status, that brilliance doesn't wear a uniform, and that even when the world stops listening, it doesn't mean you stop having something to say. Max didn't forget. Weeks later, he still talked about the man who fixed gravity when his friends came over. He printed out the final version of his project and taped it to his wall. In the corner, he scribbled, "RK4 method, recommended by someone who saw the world clearly." He never called Malcolm the pizza guy again. To him, Malcolm was a guide. A proof that knowledge and kindness aren't limited to classrooms. That sometimes, the most brilliant minds aren't in front of a blackboard. They're standing on your porch, waiting for you to open more than just the door. And Blakeworth? He started asking people their names. The barista, the janitor, the delivery drivers. Not out of guilt, but out of a quiet vow never to make the same mistake again. Malcolm continued working. Quietly, steadily, still delivering pizzas, still reading at night, still writing notes in the margins of old physics books. He never reclaimed a title, never sought applause. But something had changed. Not in his circumstances, in the way the world moved around him. Less judgment, more pause, more space for possibility. Because sometimes the greatest impact you'll ever have isn't in a lecture hall, or a paycheck, or a plaque on the wall. Sometimes, it's in a moment when someone finally sees you for everything you've always been. This story isn't about pizza, or physics, or redemption. It's about perception, about the quiet power of what happens when we stop assuming and start seeing. Malcolm never needed your admiration. He never asked to be applauded. He didn't need to be invited back into the university. All he needed was to be treated like a person whose worth wasn't defined by the shirt he wore, or the job he held, or how much money he made last week. He was brilliant when he stood in lecture halls. He was brilliant when he stood on a doorstep with a delivery bag. That never changed. Only the world's willingness to notice did. So the next time you find yourself sizing someone up, pausing at the uniform, writing the story before they open their mouth, stop. Because you never really know. You don't know what someone has survived, what they've sacrificed, what they're still capable of, even when the world no longer asks them to show it. And maybe, just maybe, the next great teacher is standing right in front of you. So if this story moved you, if it made you pause, even for a second, then share it. Not for Malcolm, but for every person who's been misjudged, overlooked, or underestimated. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that peel back the assumptions and reveal something human underneath, then subscribe to Hidden Justice, because the world doesn't just need louder voices. It needs quieter truths, told with care, and remembered with respect.